Alrighty, so this is basically an addendum to yesterday's video, and this is also what I get for trying to do yesterday's video off of memory and not having any notes. Of course. Of course, I'd forget things. This time around, I have notes! Basic notes, but notes nonetheless. There's not really going to be any sort of rhyme or reason to this, it's just going to be things that I forgot to mention last time. First thing on the agenda, buff the Comanche. Well, kind of, not really. Well, it would be a buff, technically, but as an extra customization option. The idea I'm thinking is basically to give the Comanche a laser in the same upgrade slot as the radar. The idea is that you can upgrade it to have the radar, and then to have the radar and a laser. And there would actually be a bit of precedent for this. You see, the Comanche, specifically the RAH-66 Comanche, was designed to conduct. It was basically designed to work alongside the then new Apache longbows and spot targets for them. In fact, in that designation, RAH-66, R stands for reconnaissance, A and H standing for attack and helicopter. You could see other examples of this with things like the RQ-4, the RQ-7, the RQ-170, and so on. So just give it another upgrade option that gives it a laser. I suppose you could basically play it in one of two ways. You can either make it more heavily armed with the laser, or without the laser, and treat it like a more conventional attack helicopter, or you can leave it more lightly armed to try and keep the cost down, but give it the laser and use it like a stealthy target designator. Also, on the subject, one thing that I kind of want to see is the ability for some units to select which type of Hellfire that you can actually equip on them. There's two types of Hellfires. There's an anti-armor version of the Hellfire, and there's a DP, or dual purpose, for lack of a better term, version of the Hellfire. For some aircraft, some, not all, it would be kind of nice if we could choose which Hellfires we could mount. I'm thinking specifically things like the MH-60 DAP, the MH-6, the Kiowa, the OH-58, and maybe some of the Apache variants. The idea is just so you have an option of either going with the anti-tank Hellfires or the more flexible high explosive Hellfires. I don't really see mounting the anti-tank Hellfires on drones. That might be going a little bit too far, even if it would be funny. But just on some of the helicopters. Again, the DAP, the Killer Egg, the Kiowa, maybe some of the Apaches, maybe the Comanche, things like that, to try and make things a little bit more flexible. I also don't expect to see the AT version of the Hellfire mounted on things like the M6 Linebacker, the M SHORAD, or the MML. That might be a little bit much for all of the associated platforms, considering that all three of them are ostensibly anti-aircraft platforms, and you would be turning them, if you gave them the anti-tank Hellfire, you'd be turning them into surprisingly effective anti-tank platforms. I mean, I suppose it would be an upgrade option, but it might be borderline OP. Another little interesting idea might be to give the M60 in the Marine specialization a new upgrade option. The idea is to remove the ERA off of the M60, and then give it a third upgrade option to mount the ERA on either the M60 or the M728. And when you remove the ERA, maybe bring the price down accordingly, like 5 or 10 points or something. And then you can put the ERA back on either the base M60A1 or the CEV, just to give it that little bit of extra survivability. Even if it doesn't actually upgrade the vehicle's health itself, you would still have the extra protection from the ERA. Granted, it's not a whole bunch of protection, but it is still extra protection. Next, I wanted to suggest a small buff for the S300 series SAMs. You see, when you take the S300, either the S300V4 or the S300 PM, and you go for the alternate upgrade options, either giving the S300V4 the two bigger missiles, or the S300 PM the longer ranged missiles, what you have is a system that can shoot further than it can actually see. For example, the S300V4 with the two missiles, the missiles can go out to 4,500 meters or 9,000 meters with the radar active, but it can only see out to 4,000 meters or 8,000 meters with the radar active. And the S300 PM2, if memory serves, the missiles can go out to 4,300 meters or 8,600 meters with the radar active, but it can only see, again, to 4,000 meters or 8,000 meters with the radar active. What this means, at least as far as I can tell, and granted, if other things can spot air targets for the SAM, this wouldn't be as much of an issue. But from what I can tell, what this means is that you're not going to be able to see the target until it's already within weapons range, which means that the extra range is a bit pointless because the target's already going to be anywhere between, assuming you have the radar on, 600 to 1,000 meters within weapons range by the time you see it, and there's also the time it takes for you to aim at it. So why would I take the longer range missiles when in practice they aren't going to have any longer range than the other missiles? But if you were to buff the view range of the SAMs to, say, 4,500 meters, that's without radar, then it would make more sense to actually mount those upgrades, because you can actually take advantage of that longer range. And another reason why I mention this is because it is basically as future proofing, because I do plan on mentioning a couple of other long range SAM systems in future videos like this. Also, I do realize that there are other Russian vehicles that could be added to the game. For example, there's a number of potential BMP-3 variants that could be added to the game. An example of that would be something like the UR-07, which is supposed to be a replacement to the UR-77 Meteorite. That might be an interesting new unit to add to mechanized, but the whole thing with the BMPs kind of perfectly encapsulates the problem that I have. You see, there are three specializations that Russia has that either use the BMP-3 or a vehicle with a chassis of the BMP-3. The most obvious is the BMP-3 in the mech infantry specialization. And then, in coastal troops, you have the BMP-3F, which is a navalized version of the BMP-3, and you also have the BT-3F. And, in guards, you have the 2S31 Vena, which is a large caliber mortar on a BMP-3 chassis. Now, if all of those BMP-3 variants were folded into the same specialization, you can make the same argument that I made with the AMPVs, or the Humvees in the previous video. One BMP-3 variant that I thought was kind of interesting was basically a BMP-3 chassis, but with the BMP-2 Berserk turret from the BMP-2, the one with the cornets and I think the grenade launcher as well. I thought that could be kind of interesting as a sort of cheap BMP-3, maybe kind of like the BMP-3 version of the BMP-2 Reserve, which is the BMP-2 without the AT launcher. The problem is, where do I put it? Do I put it in mech? But that already has the BMP-3. Or do I make it an option of the BMP-3? Do I put it in coastal? Or heck, should I put it in guard? If all the BMP-3 variants were located in one specialization, that would make things simpler. Another interesting BMP-3 version would be the, for lack of a better term, predecessor to the 2S31 Vena. This basically called for a BMP-3 chassis used to haul around, if memory serves, a 152mm gun. I'm guessing it's like a small SPG kind of like the Akatsuya. The problem is that both Mechanized and Guard already have their own versions of a small 152mm SPG, either in the form of the Acacia itself or the Mazda S. So maybe hand it to coastal troops? I don't know, but that's the problem. Alternatively, I can hold it back for another Russian specialization, which is what I think I'm going to do. The next thing on the list is talking about towed systems. Now, this is something I've seen a lot of people ask for, and granted, there's some good merit behind it, but implementation might be harder than some people think. The way I see it, there's two basic ways that you can incorporate tow systems, like towed artillery pieces. The first wouldn't technically be any different than the way artillery systems work in game now. At least it wouldn't be any different as far as the game is concerned. Think of it like this. Say you have a unit that is both the artillery piece and a towing vehicle. As far as the game is concerned, this wouldn't be any different than a self-propelled howitzer. The biggest difference is that it would require more emplacement and displacement time between being able to shoot after moving or being able to move after shooting. It would technically be a self-propelled unit, but it would take about 10 to 15 seconds to go from moving to shooting or vice versa. Combine that with a bit of animation magic, and you have your towed, quote-unquote, system. For example, let's say you're towing an M777, you get to a firing position, and the system emplaces, and you get to see the spades come down, the truck unhooks and maybe drives off to the side, and the system in places that way. Then you can shoot, and when it's time to move again, the spades come back up, the truck basically reverses its previous movements, hooks back to the howitzer, and then you're ready to move again. Visually, it would look like a towed system, but as far as the game's concerned, this wouldn't be any different than a M109. Or maybe an air defense system would probably be a more accurate comparison. Alternatively, and I think this would be more complicated, is that you could have units that would rely on other units to move. So you have a howitzer, that is its own unit, and it cannot move by itself. You need to take another unit in the form of a truck, like for example an MTV, hook it to the howitzer. Maybe you'd have a special command to select the unit and then basically select tow. Kind of like you can tell a unit to hold, fire, or drop off supplies. But you tell a supply truck like an MTV, go tow that 155 or that M777. The truck hooks up to it, can tow it. Maybe the truck has a slight speed penalty because it's towing a 155, and obviously the howitzer can't shoot, and then the truck would need to tow it to a new position, unhook it. It would then probably automatically in place. You can shoot it, and then you could just tell the truck to tow it again. The system would automatically displace, and then you can move it around again. As for ammunition supply, in the first option, the one where the whole thing is technically a self-propelled vehicle, you could actually have a deceptively large amount of ammunition because you could just store it in the truck. In the second option, you could still potentially use the truck to haul supplies, and then when the truck stops for the system to shoot, just drop the supplies off, and it could resupply that way. The howitzer itself, however, would probably still have 2 or 3 rounds on hand, just so the game's ammunition handling logic doesn't get too weird or need too many changes to facilitate the new type of vehicle or new type of unit. But you could potentially do a lot with towed systems. I use the M777 as an example. That there's things like towed air defense systems, mortars. There's a Miklik, which, although if I understand correctly, I think you can actually fire I think it's an M58 is the designation for it. I think you can actually fire it without having to unhook it from the towed vehicle. So you technically don't need to make it a specifically towed unit. You can make it just as towed, quote unquote, as the Patriot system is. However, depending on exactly how you want to take this system for towed units, you can potentially get a little crazy with it. I'd like to point out that the Soviets developed some very large towed artillery systems. And when I say large, I mean 16.5-inch diameter. Not 155, 420. So, if you want to incorporate something like that, you're talking about a gun system that is very, very large. Would it be necessarily useful? I don't know. But dropping a 16.5-inch HE shell on something would be interesting and potentially fun. Of course, if you wanted to go the other way, you could potentially introduce other towed guns for the US like Atomic Annie. I think that could fire a conventional HE shell instead of your your nuclear option, but it could still be interesting nonetheless. But again, you can use this system for anything from artillery to air defense systems or anything else that would theoretically need to be towed. Although this does bring me to another upgrade option that you could potentially apply to a lot of supply vehicles, specifically trailers. The idea being is that for an extra 10 or 20 points, you can attach a trailer to the supply vehicle in question to increase its cargo capacity by a couple metric tons. One thing I wanted to suggest would basically be like new game modes. And I know it'd be pretty rich for someone who doesn't play multiplayer to suggest multiplayer game modes, but I just wanted to stick my oar in. The idea would basically be for grand battles, for lack of a better term. Instead of having 5 players per side, you only have 3. But instead of having instead of being able to make a deck with 2 specializations for a total of 10,000 points, you're able to make a deck with 3 specializations for a total of 15,000 points. Now, as interesting of an idea as this sounds, I can't help but think that it would probably throw a bit of a spanner in the works when it comes to how the game's balanced. Each specialization, obviously, has their own strengths and weaknesses. And when you make a specialization combination, the deck is going to have its own strengths and weaknesses. But if you're able to combine 3 specializations together, you're probably going to be able to cover all areas at least adequately well. So, I'm not entirely sure how a system like this would work with the current game structure. If memory serves, the developers said that they wanted the decks to be flexible but not super multi-purpose. As interesting and honestly fun as it would be to make a deck out of 3 specializations, I'm not sure it would necessarily fit a multiplayer context. Now, if they wanted to add larger, more complex scenarios, then oh yeah, that's something I could definitely see. Then again, you can do current scenarios with just 2 decks, as is. Maybe at some point in the future we can get something like that. I'm not exactly sure it'd be anytime soon, and I'm not entirely sure it would be necessary, but it would at least be interesting. The last idea I wanted to suggest would basically be for lack of a better term, super deck, or core deck. Or maybe just call it core instead of deck. The idea here is to basically make a core by combining 2 decks. So you have 2 decks, maybe 2 pre-made decks, and you combine them to make a core. So say I can make a core out of combining a Striker and Armor Brigade deck with a Marine and SOCOM deck. And then I basically have all the units to play with that I put in those 2 decks at the numbers that I put them in those decks. Another interesting thing would be if you want to combine decks with the same specialization. So, for example, if I had an Armored Striker deck and a Armored Marine deck, I would have 2 decks, both with Armor Brigade. And so if I, say, put 2 Set V3s in each deck and 4 Set V2s in each deck, I would have, in the core deck, 4 set V3s and 8 set V2s. Another alternative would basically be to take one deck and put it in the core twice. So if I had, say, again, an Armored Striker deck, I could put an Armored Striker deck. I could basically put the same deck in the core twice. So it's effectively the same as the Armored Striker deck. I just have twice as many units to play with. Of course, I'm not entirely sure any of these ideas would work out, but it would be at least kind of interesting. That said, I honestly don't think we're going to see any ideas like this because it would be such a big departure from the game. I think the one that we're most likely to see would be the ability to make a deck out of 3 specializations, but that's still probably going to be a long way off if it ever actually reaches the game. Anyway, that covers all the extra things that I wanted to cover.